I spent years thinking that if I could climb 9A, then I would like look up at El Cap and it would look easy because you're like, oh, it's only 7C.
Mm,
If I can climb 9A, then 7C is going to look easy or 7C plus or whatever. But either way, I thought that if I raised my top end high enough, that that sort of mid range would look easy. And then after many
yeah.
years, I realized two things. One, that my top end was just never going to be that high. And two, that even if my top end was that high, it still wasn't going to look easy, because there's certain climbs that no matter how strong you are, they still look hard. This is climbing gold. I feel like people are almost never held back, or people almost never touch their physical limits. And
No
like an
way.
example of this, like when I still was climbing outdoors, like last month, I was climbing with a friend of mine at this cave, and this friend of mine basically fell off the last move of her project like 15 times now. And I'm kind of like, I just know that you aren't physically limited because
Yeah.
just statistics wise, there's no way that you tapped into your maximum potential effort 15 times in a row. Like, obviously, that's a mental thing. That's a failure of execution. You're just botching. And it's funny because, you don't want to be unsympathetic to your climbing partner because you're like, oh, yeah, that's tough. Like good effort. You did great up there. But after like the third time she fell there, I was like, what are you doing? This is a complete botch. Like, get your head out of your butt and just like do the moves.
Yeah,
Because you're
totally.
like, I mean, if it was like Adam Ondra falling on the last moves, you're like, yeah, maybe he's like managing to tap into the very absolute limit of his effort. But like, people can't really do that. It's like you can only
Yeah.
tap into your max physical performance like every once in a blue moon. And if you're falling at the same place two times in a row in the same day, like that's a mental thing. Like you're botching.
Yeah, something else is going on there. It's not because your fingers aren't strong enough.
Yeah, it's like either you don't know how to do the move, like you actually just don't have the beta, or you have psychological things going on where you get there and you just don't execute. But,
Yeah, which
you
which
know,
most of us do. Like there's no way around that. It's hard work to be a relatively good rock climber, to climb at your highest level is really difficult.
though a lot of the time that's just a matter of getting out of your own way and just letting your body do the thing that it's supposed to be doing. Just like turning it all off and just going with it.
Yeah.
But yeah.
One of the things I've always been really curious about with climbing and training is that I feel like other sports, like when you're a professional football player, you take a few months off in between your
Mm.
seasons, and you have like a break where your body rests and you kind of like aren't playing the game.
I
But
actually is that actually true though? You're not playing the game, but I feel like most other sports they are doing strength training and they are doing conditioning the whole time, and
Mhm.
very few sports are actually resting the whole time. So I
no,
feel
I'm
like
not
well,
full
no,
rest, but
I
like
know, but I feel like the climbing translation would be like, oh, you're not projecting outdoors, but you're training in the gym for your whole off season. And
yeah,
so
but I think that like climbers have a different level of constantly expecting performance, even when training,
Yeah.
you know?
Hmm.
And I wonder about that because I don't think it's realistic. And I wonder why that's gotten into our culture where it's like we always have to be performing, you know?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's something that maybe got pulled in. I don't know when it got pulled in, but it was certainly not the way I thought about training for climbing when I started. And it's not the way I think about it now, is that you're ever going to be performing at your highest level forever. It's going to wax and wane. My whole goal of doing a training cycle is to have you, when you go over that hump and you're back down to whatever your base level is, I want your base level to be a little higher than it was when you started training the last time. That's really the big goal of especially the physical training side for me. You have a little more capacity, you have a little more strength when you start back into the gym. And I just don't think it's possible to perform at your highest level all the time. Alex, I'm curious what you would say about the difference between, say, an endurance athlete and an intensity athlete is that, in my mind, is that the endurance athlete is very often performing closer to what seems like their top level when they're not focused on intensity. Whereas the intensity athlete, it's going to be harder to hit that very, very top level all the time. So I'm curious your thoughts there.
I'm not sure what you mean. Like what does that look like in practical terms for climbers? Like what is an endurance climber?
So let's
Eh,
say, a person who's doing tons and tons of pitches or lots of, wall climbing, something like that, and they're really solid at the 511 level. 512 level, whatever it is.
Mhm.
And they can do every 512, but they've never done 513. And then the intensity athlete is more like they've climbed a really hard grade, but they can only do 6 of those in a day, and then they're, you know, 6 routes in a day of any grade, and then they're shot.
Mhm.
So I think the endurance athlete looks like they're performing at their highest all the time when they're actually not. I think that's what I'm getting at here. Is
Yeah,
if
well,
we're
I mean, you're actually perfectly describing my entire career as a climber.
That's why I was curious what your thoughts were.
It's funny because I've always looked at, so many of my counterpart sort of professional climbing friends who, like, for example, we're sort of family friends with Paige Clausen and Ariane Cock, who are, both
Yeah.
sort of professional climbers, two of the best climbers in the country.
Yeah.
And Paige is much stronger than me, climbs harder grades, but realistically in a given year, she'll climb 4 meaningful routes to her, maybe.
Right.
It's like she'll do 4 things that are just like limit. And she'll climb like an hour and a half every other day, and that's it. Like that's all she climbs. And when she does, it's limit effort, and she does very hard things every once in a while. But so she'll go climbing somewhere for a month and literally do nothing except for the warm up and the project, and then she'll send her project, which is very, very hard, like probably the hardest route in the area, one of the hardest routes
Yeah.
in the country. And then
No
she'll go
doubt.
home and just like train indoors for a while and like take care of her baby, which is totally amazing. And so, I look at that and I'm like, man, that could not be more different than my style of climbing, where at
Mhm.
least in the past, I mean, it's a little bit different now as a dad, but I would just be climbing 6 days a week, like doing all kinds of stuff, like adventuring, doing lots of pitches. But my top end was so much lower than all these other friends because I just like couldn't pull that hard. And you're kind of like, well, yeah, I guess that's the nature. If you're climbing 6 days a week, you just don't quite have that top end.
Yeah. I think we get fooled into it by the media thinking that we need to be performing all the time. You know, if you look at Adam Ondra, he's not climbing 15D every day. You know, he's climbed a couple of them, a handful of them.
I think he's climbed one of them actually.
One or two. Has he only done one?
Yeah,
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 maybe
because the
one.
other
You might be
supposed
right.
D in the world is a Seb.
Yeah. Seb's route, yeah, DNA.
Yeah.
So I think we just get fooled into it. We think, because these climbers are doing 14D or 15A regularly, that means they're climbing at their top level all the time. But in reality, that's an on-site level for Adam Ondra. So he's doing tons of that level of climbing. We just think it's so much bigger.
Yeah, I think that the principle at play there is that people look at climbing headlines and they're sort of like, it's all really hard, so they're doing elite things. And you're like, no,
Yeah,
no. When you
totally.
think of it at a personal level for that individual climber, it's so far below their limit that you're like, is that even news for them? Like he probably doesn't care. It's just the bystander is impressed by it because they're like, whoa. Like you see that all the time with like 88.nu headlines about Adam Ondra, where it's like he's on a family vacation in Croatia and he onside like 10.8Cs. And you're kind of
Right.
like, for me, that's amazing. But I'm like, does Adam even care about that? Because he probably just
Right.
sees that as like a normal day of climbing with his wife and his baby. He's just like out having a good time.
Yep.
And he's just at such a high level that feels casual to him. He's just like, what a fun day. I just did all the nice new routes at this cool sector. And, like he'll never even remember the names of the routes. He's just like, oh, that was cool. You're like, God, that's
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Maybe to answer that, Leici, maybe I said that wrong. We're not getting tricked by the media. We're tricking ourselves, I think. The media is
Mm,
reporting what's happening, and we're looking at it as if they're at their highest level all the time.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting because even professional climbers, I know, believe that often,
Mhm.
like not to call you out, Alex, but
Let's call
Let's
Alex
hear it.
out.
Let's hear it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Call me out. What about?
But, often when Alex feels like he's not performing, he's like, what the crap? I'm not performing right now.
Yeah,
And I do it too. I think it's normal, but I think it's
totally
because
normal.
we look around and we're like, everyone else seems to be performing all the time, you know?
We
What's
we want to be doing our best.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I
one
do.
random thing around performance is that I mean, I think for me personally, part of the reason I feel like I'm not performing is because at least like this winter, especially because I've just been trying to sport climb hard slash climb the gym, and it's so
Mm,
easy to sort of see. But in the past, when I was just like living in a van as a single person, just traveling and doing stuff, there was so much low-hanging fruit. There's like easy things that have never been soloed before, speed records that nobody's ever done. Like basically there was easy room for achievement, like basically every month. I was just talking to my wife about this, but I was like, I used to consider myself sort of a failure if I didn't achieve something every month, basically.
Mm.
Or like each month I'd like go to some new area and like do something that felt meaningful to me. But that's partially because there was so much easy stuff to do. You know, you're kind of like, oh, well, nobody's ever soloed this before. Nobody's ever done a speed record. Like this is all just like easy for me to sort of scoop up these like achievements. And now, 20 years later, you're kind of like, especially living in one place and not just like roaming the West nonstop, like looking for easy things to do. Kind of like there's just not that much easy stuff to do achievement wise anymore. And so then when you start beating your head against your actual personal limits and like your own, physiological limits, now I'm like, oh, it's a lot harder to achieve when you're just testing yourself against yourself. Because, it's like realistically, if you want to get better, it takes a long time and a lot of hard work.
I'm curious, like, do you find it easier to sort of um, feel accomplished when those accomplishments are coming more often, or when they're a bigger accomplishment? Which is better for you, do you think?
No, I've always liked volume more than
Mm.
intensity. That's the thing is like and this is part of the reason that I've never been a great climber in some ways, or a high performing, well, whatever, however you want to frame it. I've never climbed the hardest grades, is because I've always preferred to do all the routes at a crag rather than the hardest route at the crag. Like if there are
Sure.
30 pitches at the crag, I'd rather climb the 29 that I can do and skip the hardest one. And then I have a lot of friends who will only climb the hardest one and none of the others. But I'm the guy that wants to climb the 0-star route that's way over on the right, that's like crumbling and covered in spider webs. And I'm like, what an adventure! That's cool. Whereas a lot of my friends are like, that is a complete waste of your time. Like, why would you climb that? And I'm like, because it's cool. Look at it. It's like it's an adventure. I don't
Yeah.
know.
I
Have you
mean,
gone?
oh,
Go ahead.
sorry, I keep interrupting, but I feel like that's one thing that actually makes you like really good at what you do is you are able to read rocks so well because you've spent so much time on so many different types of terrain. Like just having personally watched you climb a lot, you know, you're very natural at being like, oh, here's where my foot goes, here's where my body position needs to be. Whereas like I'm up there just like fumbling, you know?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I think if you spend a lot of time soloing, a lot of time adventure climbing, trad climbing, you just have to get that intuitive read of rock where like you just have
Yeah.
to feel comfortable moving over rock. And I've always loved that, but it cuts off my high end. It's like
Yeah.
I've basically been able to climb 14A or B for uh almost 20 years, and not harder. And I'm like, oh, it's slightly embarrassing. But I've basically been climbing 14 minus for like 15 years. And I'm sort of like, it'd be great to climb a little harder, but like, boy, it sure is hard to climb harder.
Yeah. I think that's what it comes down to. It's just hard to do your hardest things.
Mhm.
It's a lot of work. Um, some people love that work, and some people want to just do more. And I think both approaches are totally valid, different types of hard work. It just really depends on what your goal is, how you're preparing for it.
That's the thing with goals. Like, I mean, to come back to El Cap stuff, but like with training for El Cap, I spent years thinking that if I could climb 9A, then I would like look up at El Cap and it would look easy because you're like, oh, it's only
Mm,
7C. If I can climb 9A, then 7C is going to look easy, or 7C plus or whatever. But either way, I thought that if I raised my top end high enough, that sort of mid range would look easy. And then after many
yeah.
years, I realized two things. One, that my top end was just never going to be that high. And two, that even if my top end was that high, it still wasn't going to look easy, because there's certain climbs that no matter how strong you are, they still look hard. And so
Yeah.
I sort of realized that whole approach of like, oh, I just need to get my top end up there. I was like, that's just not the right approach. Because realistically, to solo a big wall, all you have to do is feel confident on that particular grade. It's like you don't need to be able to climb the hardest grades. You don't have to be able to boulder. You certainly don't have to be able to do a one arm pull up on an edge. You just have to feel confident on that specific grade. And I was like, all right, well, I can train for that.
Yeah.
I was like,
I
I'll never climb 14D, but I can be rock solid on 12D. So I was like, well, I'll take what I can get.
I years ago when I was like breaking into 513, I think I was working on what would become my first at the time, or maybe I'd done one or two. But anyway, I was having a conversation with Sonny Trotter,
Hmm.
and when I mentioned like, oh, I'm just breaking into 513, 513 still feels really hard for me. And whether he believed it or not, he seemed believable. And he said, 513 still feels really hard to me. And it like blew my little mind open. That was like, oh, this guy who climbs as hard as he does still finds this grade hard. That was really comforting.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, well,
thanks
that's
for
kind of the
lying
thing
to
is
me,
no
Sonny.
matter, well, I think that's kind of true is that I mean, and this is true for a lot of climbers, I think, no matter how high their high end goes, it's still like they're not guaranteed to onsite 513. They're not
Right.
guaranteed. And that's, I mean, that's not true for like Adam Onder and certain people like Alex Megos. I mean, there's like he's probably guaranteed to onsite 8A, like 13B, basically anywhere in any style. But that's definitely not true for a lot of other high-end sport climbers. And even really experienced sport climbers, like there are a lot of like, I don't know, I climb with Joe Kinder from time to time because he lives in town here. And you're like, he's a good climber. He's climbed a lot of 14 plus, 15 minus E kind of routes, but he is not guaranteed to onsite 513. Like
Sure.
he goes up and he basically goes bolt to bolt. He touches the holds. He's kind of like, bro, this is whack. I'm not into this, and then he like comes down and you're like, okay.
Anything Bert.
Yeah,
No.
exactly. Like if he has to weight his feet, he's like, nah, I'm not into this. This style sucks. And you're kind of like, really? You're so strong. And yet they're like big holes. I don't know. I've always
Yeah.
kind of gone the other direction where it's like, I'd rather be able to climb every climb of a certain grade than to be able to climb the next grade,
Yeah.
in a way.
I've been saying a lot lately that I think being adaptable is probably the best skill a rock climber can have. And I think you build that through trying really hard on different things, climbing easy things on different terrain, putting yourself in scenarios that are scary or make you anxious or,
Mhm.
that just don't make any sense and are confusing. That's how you become adaptable. And I think that's the best thing a rock climber can be.
No, I totally agree. Yeah, expanding your comfort zone. And it's interesting when you talk about climbing, training for climbing, how often does somebody's training for climbing include things that make them scared or like that actually push them outside of their comfort zone?
We try to all the time. We try to make all of our plans sort of force you out of your comfort zone a little bit with different movement drills that maybe make you anxious. You don't want to climb in this way, you don't want to move that way, but we're
Hmm.
asking you to move in really specific ways just to get you comfortable with being uncomfortable, if if that
What's an
makes any
example of
sense.
that?
I mean,
Something like we have a popular drill called sloth monkeys is what they are affectionately known as. And it's essentially climbing really, really slow and controlled and continuous, and then doing the same route or same boulder, more like a monkey, where you're trying to use rhythm and you aren't, setting up in a stable position after every move. You're jumping between holds. And a lot of people have a really hard time pulling the trigger in that more monkey style climbing and feeling like they can move that way. So we just build the comfort in getting anxious and in pulling the trigger anyway, and
Hmm.
seeing what happens with that. So that's a
That's
very
interesting.
low level example, but
That's been one of the things that I've liked about campusing on problems at the end of a session is that it forces you to do a lot of that monkeying because there's so many
yeah,
holds that like aren't really usable in and of themselves. But if you swing between them, then you can kind of squeeze
totally.
holds together and you can, like basically side pulls and underclings are impossible to campus on unless you're like really
Unless you've
fast
got
between them.
momentum. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so for me anyway, it feels like a personal triumph every time I can actually move between side pulls because I'm like, oh my God, it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm like a monkey. It feels so cool.
I
Like
love
it's
it.
the
Yeah.
opposite of my normal style. But anyway,
I,
all right. I was like, should we just call this, Leici? Because we could just talk about
I
climbing
know
for
we
We could
could
just
like
keep going
indefinitely. I'm
forever.
like,
Yeah.
we
yeah,
could
totally.
talk
I was like, maybe
forever.
maybe you should do a follow-up episode, Chris, where you have us on your podcast and we'll just talk like climbing specifics for
Yeah.
hours. I
Let's
was like,
do it. Let's
I
do
Climbing
was
it.
like,
history.
yeah, totally. I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm totally into it, but I am actually about to go to my garage and our nanny leaves in 2 hours, and I'm sort of like, oh, I want to get my sesh before the nanny leaves, and I'm like, I got to do
Yeah,
some rock climbing.
Do it.
Yeah.
thank you so much,
Um,
Chris. We really
Yeah.
dude,
Thanks,
appreciate
Lacey. I
you.
appreciate it.
yeah, no,
Good to see
Yeah.
both of your faces.
yeah, it's a
Yeah,
total
you
pleasure
too.
chatting. I'm like, I love climbing training stuff. I'm like so into
Yeah.
it.
Anytime. Let's do it again.